Facebook, Pinterest, Twitter, LinkedIn, these are all social media companies that are blowing up the web these days. And the data that's being shared there is very important to people as individuals, but also to businesses. How valuable, though, is that information to organizations? And is one piece of social data, something that you might see on Yelp or Twitter, worth more than another? Say what you might see on Facebook or LinkedIn. That is going to be the topic of today's Hot Topic. Just how do these social media points of interest affect your company's bottom line? On the agenda for today, we have quite a bit to talk about. We're going to be looking specifically at the economics of social media. We're going to be talking about how much is social media content worth to you and your organization. We're also going to be looking at backing up your social data. Just what exactly does that look like? And of course, time permitting, we're also going to take as many of your questions as we can today. Joining me via Skype, we have two terrific guests. One of them is the CEO and co-founder of the company called Backupify, Rob May. We certainly appreciate having you with us today, Rob.
Thanks for having me. I'm glad to be on.
And joining me via New York Skype in our CBS Interactive offices there is ZDNet blogger and editor Andrew Nuska. Andrew, we certainly appreciate you being with us as well.
Good afternoon.
So we're going to start today with Andrew. I know this topic is really in your wheelhouse, Andrew, and that is this idea. And we're going to bring a poll up in just a second. But first, we wanted to get you to weigh in here, and that is this idea that social media is certainly a very important business play. I would start with you by asking this question: is social media for business all that it's cracked up to be?
That's a funny question. It is and it isn't. There's two ways to answer that question. It isn't because there's a lot of hypes that surround social media, and so as we all know, businesses feel a burning desire to involve themselves with it without necessarily knowing why. But on the other hand, it really is mission critical because social media, what is social but your customers? If you're not in tune with your customers, you know, you're a failed business waiting to happen. So two sides to the same coin, I suppose.
Yeah. Do you think it's important for every company at this stage to have some sort of social media component or a strategy at least to either push who they are or their products?
I think yes, but in the most basic of senses. Sometimes a strategy is to not be on social media. That's not to say you shouldn't communicate with your customers, but you need to be where your customers are. And too often in recent years, I've seen companies who are pushing their products, and pushing is the key word here. That's a broadcast. That's a one-way street. When social really needs to be two ways. It really needs to be part of your customer service, mindset. And so I think that companies really just need to ascertain what social media can do for their company, how it fits into their existing fundamental strategy.
Rob, I don't want to leave you out there hanging in the wind. We know that we're going to talk a lot about what Backupify does, and also this idea of backing up social media content, what that looks like. But I want to get your take here on this idea of social media as a strategy for business.
Well, it's definitely been useful for us, right? I mean, you can think about the infographic that we've put out as it's really spread via social media. So it's brought in some new customers. It's raised awareness about Backupify. It's put us at the center of this discussion about the value of data in the cloud. So we've been successful with social media. I think I agree that there's a lot of hype around it, and there's a lot of people believe the wrong things and are trying things that don't work very well. But there's also a lot of things that do work, and there's a lot of companies that can benefit a lot from social media.
Yeah, we're going to take a look at that infographic in just a moment. But first, I want to also have both of you weigh in really on the idea of can you risk by leaning into social media too much? Is there a way of being over social when it comes to an organization, both from the products or services that they're pushing, but also just the content that gets put out there? It can be very revealing to a company in regards to what they put out socially. We'll start with Andrew.
I think that you can't be too social if social is a two-way street. but you definitely can be if it's a one-way. I think that all of the examples that we see where a company fails, it's because they're pushing something and they're not listening. They're talking and they're not listening. So I think, but if it's a two-way street, well, I mean, how could you go wrong by being perfectly in tune with your customers? I can't see that being a problem.
Rob?
Yeah, so I think social media is just like any other part of a business, right? What you do on social media has to map to your broader strategies or as an organization, right? Everything for a company has to tie together, right? Your sales process, your customer support process is the way you reach customers. And so I think you are at risk of sharing too much and being too social if that's not your target demographic and that's not the way that your customers want to find information about the industry or about your products. So just the way that you wouldn't have a crazy sales process for a very simple product like for an iPod, right? Like nobody comes to your house and gives you a demo and does that kind of stuff. That's not how it's marketed and sold. And so social media can be the same way, right? It all has to tie together, and you need the strategy that's appropriate for the kind of customer segment that you're targeting.
Yeah. We got somebody calling in. So that kind of leads us to the next point. And what I'm going to do, two things. I'm going to push a poll right now to our viewers who are with us live. For those of you who are going to be joining us via on demand, you won't be able to experience this. But I want to push this poll out right now and get folks to weigh in on it. The question is, does your organization have a strategy for measuring social media data's ROI? Yes, no, we're working on it. There is no accurate way to measure social ROI. We'll give folks a moment to take a look at those and weigh in. But we also want to ask you gentlemen to weigh in. Andrew, we'll start with you. This is a very hot topic. A lot of people want to know the idea of, can we measure an ROI based on the content that we put out, whatever that may be for our organization. And that seems to be a magic bullet that nobody's been able to really put their finger on so far.
Yeah, it's tough. I mean, we're talking about social media in a very general sense. You can measure certain aspects of that whole sphere, but it's really hard to have a single, as you said, like a silver bullet, a magic bullet, with regard to measuring this. What you can do is go in with really finite goals, and as we were discussing earlier, you can say, okay, well, I want to acquire more customers. Well, then that's better, because then you can start to loosely connect the dots as to, okay, well, they're liking our Facebook page, how many of them are also in our customer database, and so forth. But there is no one metric that's going to win and that you can attach to dollars.
So, Rob, how do you feel about this notion of measuring ROI?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a little bit difficult. A lot of the measurements that people use today are indirect. I mean, we do measure things like who comes directly from Twitter or from Facebook and signs up for a trial, and do they become a customer. But social media channels usually don't drive direct relationships with prospects that way. So we also use some indirect measurements, and one of those measurements, for example, is the number of people that Google the term Backupify and then come and become a customer. Right? If they're going to Google the term, they've obviously heard about us somewhere. Well, where was that? Well, we don't necessarily know, but if we've run a bunch of campaigns that encourage more participation on Twitter or Facebook, got us a lot more press, then if the number of people Googling Backupify goes up, we assume that some part of that's been driven by our social media marketing efforts. But it's not a one-to-one direct correlation, so it is difficult.
Right. So we're gonna take a look at the results here, and it looks like 100% of our audience say they are currently working on some kind of strategy for measuring social media data's ROI. I don't think that's really surprising to any of us. What do you guys think?
I'm not surprised. I think if they figure out a really good strategy, they've got the basis to start a new company. So,
okay. So next up, we're going to dive a little bit more into this idea of how much media content is worth. And what we want to do real quick, and I know, Rob, you guys produced this at Backupify, but we also want Andrew to weigh in on it, this infographic. Connor, if you could pull that up for us so we can take a look at it. It's fascinating to look at how you guys came up with this idea of being able to put a dollar figure. This is in its entirety. We're going to dive in a little bit more, but talk a little bit, first of all, Rob, about why you guys decided to put this infographic together as we take a look at it.
Yeah, so one of the debates we have internally at Backupify a lot is about how do you quantify the value of our service, right? So most of our revenue comes from backing up Google Apps installations for businesses, and there are some ways to put value on the value of your customer lists, your customer emails, and all that kind of stuff. And we started having this broader discussion as we're thinking about doing other services about what, can you put a value on a generic piece of data in the cloud, or is it service specific? Is it content type specific? And that really led to this infographic, right? This infographic was sort of meant to be a conversation starter for the web, to have people instigate these discussions around what is this data worth and why, and who's collecting the value of this data, and should we be protecting this data? And just, data has become the currency of the 21st century, and I think people are only starting to realize that, how important it is to their business, how much data they're creating that's out there. And so, so that was sort of the genesis of all this.
So, Andrew, you've had a chance to take a look at it. What did you think about this dollar, this coming up with a dollar value? And I know it, off the top of that infographic, it was showing an actual dollar figure. What is that content worth? And I think Facebook, the number was up to $118 for content, or per user.
Yeah, I think it's tough to really put a number on it. They've done a noble job in trying to. But the thing that I take away from this is really twofold. One, that data is very valuable to a lot of people. And two, what's even more valuable is what you can do with that data. I mean, if you look at across this spectrum from in the infographic, it goes all the way from Path, which is a relatively new service, to Facebook, certainly the most popular. The higher the valuation, the more potential there is to do that, to do something with that data. What I've given Instagram or Yelp or Pinterest or even Foursquare, right, where I am on any given moment, at any given moment, that may be the same data that I've already given to Facebook, but Facebook has built a platform that can do so much more with it for a business, and there's the potential for a lot bigger return. So to me, this just says, this is customer data is important, and it's all over social networks, and you got to be there too as a business.
Right. Taking a look at the next section, can we bring that up, Connor? There was 3 main sections of this. How many users does it take? This is really fascinating to me, because what you're looking at here is the different social media outlets out there, and depending on the the number of users, this really elevated or decreased the amount of dollar value. But the idea here is, how many does it take for a company to reach $10 billion? It's pretty fascinating stuff. Andrew, what do you think about that?
Well, you know how cautious I am about anything like valuations, especially now when we're talking about extra bubbles. But I think the thing that's clear about this infographic is, it's not necessarily how many users, it's what each one of those users is worth, and it's clear that the worth is different for each one of these services.
Rob, talk about what's the $10 billion? What is that? Is that like the milestone we're all trying to achieve? I know I am.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So what we were trying to show with that, and what I think it really highlights, is if you take $10 billion as an interesting sort of publicly traded company valuation, right? I mean, there's not a lot of companies that are sort of at that level in terms of market capitalization. This graphic really highlights how difficult it's going to be for a lot of these social networking companies or social media companies to get there, right? So, I mean, Facebook has done an amazing job. They're way ahead of everybody else. Twitter's done a pretty nice job. But as you can see, the types of content and the types of users that some of these people have, they'll probably never get there. So I think this really highlights, the contrast between, when you look at the first graph, right, and it shows the different value per user. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Facebook's at the top end. We understand that. This graph really shows what that means, right? The potential that a Facebook has compared to a Path or a Yelp or even an Instagram, right, which just got bought for $1 billion, but that's a long way away from $10 billion.
Right. So, and let's talk about this third piece. Do we have that one also, Connor? The third piece. It's basically explain a little bit of this one. Social currency exchange. If a company is divided, if the company's revenue is divided by content, which is interesting. What does it make? What does it take to make 10? Is this 10 billion as well?
No. So the purpose with this was we basically took either the valuation or the revenues, whatever we could find, and then the amount of content that they were creating on a regular basis to try to figure out, revenues go over a time span. So we took content over time span if we had a revenue number. If not, we tried to take a cumulative number and basically assign a value to a single tweet or a single Facebook share, right? If somebody makes one more tweet, how much does Facebook's value or does Twitter's valuation goes up? If somebody shares another piece of content, how much does Facebook's valuation go up? That's what we were trying to get at here. And the reason we wanted to do that was to draw a distinction between the different types of content and what they're worth.
Fascinating. What do you think about this notion, Andrew, bringing you into the conversation here?
Sure, I think it shows how different each one of these networks is. I mean, with some of them like Twitter, you really want that kind of, forgive the crude metaphor, but like a kind of a crack addict kind of user base. I mean, I know I can't break away from it. It's tough, whereas LinkedIn, you want a much more purposeful use there. So to me, it just illustrates how different they're all approaching what ends up being you, the customer, the human.
Right. If you're just joining us, we are talking about how much social media data is worth. Our guests today are Andrew Neska, who is a ZDNet editor and also the CEO and co-founder of Backupify, Rob May. Guys, I want to dive into this perspective. Let's take a look at companies as a brand, if you will. The ultimate goal for business, establishing these user profiles so they can understand who the people that they're selling to are, what type of information they can glean from them, and it certainly helps establish customer relationships. But it brings up an interesting point. We've seen it somewhat in the entertainment industry where, an entertainer who is also a brand. We take, for example, I'm using Lady Gaga because she has more tweet followers than God. So I'm going to use that as an example. But where, she's giving valuable information because she's telling folks where her next tour is going to be, where her next concert venues and cities. And that can be valuable from a sales perspective in terms of what her social media content is. But then you have these crazy things where it seems like it really doesn't have anything to do with the brand or the customer. And then, do you have the problem of possibly losing some of that as well? Is this part of the over socializing perspective from a business perspective? Andrew, Rob?
Certainly is. The thing that struck me about your Lady Gaga reference, and some people do believe Lady Gaga is God.
Is that you, Rob? Do you believe?
I don't.
I think if Rob has a young daughter, I'm sure she does. I think the value here is you're seeing a move of how we consume information. If Lady Gaga was popular in the 70s, for example, maybe she put up a poster saying when her next shows were. She put out a flyer or something like that, and now it's maybe just even 10 years ago it would be a newsletter of some kind, and now it's coming to you because you're already following her. The dynamic of consumption is so different. I was going to add another point, but I think I've lost it. Rob?
Well, what I think is interesting is this sort of what's the value of the different pieces of content sort of highlights that. To Andrew's point, as the way we consume different types of content has changed, we consume more types of content now. You've lowered the barrier to content creation and to content consumption, so you're getting a lot more. And I think the signal to noise ratio has changed, right? Instead of getting lots of strong signals because it was expensive to create content and disseminate that content, now you're getting a lot of stuff, which is kind of nice because you can find those diamonds in the rough. You can see things that you might not have seen before, but you also have to filter through a lot of crap sometimes in order to do it, right? Because again, when the bar's low, there's lots of people putting out lots and lots of stuff.
Right.
That's what's interesting when you look at like a Yelp review versus a tweet, right? a tweet's really easy. I can tweet in a couple of seconds. I may tweet something that's meaningless. A Yelp review takes a little bit of work, and I think that's reflected in their valuation difference.
Right. So the noise becomes sort of the fights between Lady Gaga and Justin Bieber, and you've got to know how to filter that out to make sense of it and to add, even if it's perceived value.
I also think that has to do with the company. We're talking about whether it makes sense for your company earlier in this podcast and this webcast rather. And Lady Gaga has a high incentive to continue captivating her customers, right? She needs you to buy into a certain lifestyle, a mystique. You want to know what Lady Gaga is doing all the time because she's a celebrity. Well, if you sell jet engines, perhaps you don't need to know what's going on all the time. Perhaps it's more meaningful for your business to be there when your customers need you, and we don't want to know every moment on the manufacturing floor. So it's got to make sense as well, and that plays into what Rob was saying a moment ago.
Yeah. So we're going to move on to the next section. We could talk about Lady Gaga and her value of her tweets all day long, I'm sure. But we want to talk a little bit about this notion of why it's important to secure or in some cases back up your social data content. And I want to start off with a video that Backupify and Rob, you guys put together. That's pretty compelling. Let's take a look at it, and then we're going to talk.
I'm Rob May, I'm the CEO of Backupify, and today I'm going to delete my entire Gmail account and then restore it with Backupify. Now I'm going to log into my Gmail, go to my All Mail folder. Now I'm going to delete those emails.
So Rob, essentially you're deleting your entire Gmail account, all of your email, everything is going bye-bye. I guess it's a bit of a stunt, but it was that the whole point of it, to show value in what you guys are able to do?
Now, as you can see, so we thought about it right from the LifeLock CEO who shows his social security number, right, and then says, hey, if my identity gets stolen, it doesn't matter, I have LifeLock. We wanted to do a similar thing and say, hey, this is how much faith I have in our product that I'm willing to delete my entire business Gmail account. This has financing documents from our venture capital rounds, deal relationships with companies that that help sell our products, and all kinds of stuff, resumes for people that we're going to hire, communications with my board and investors. And there's a lot of really important information in here. And if I lost that and didn't get it back, it would be pretty traumatic for the company. So we wanted to show how much faith we had in the product. Although I'll admit, my pulse went up a little bit when I actually did it. So it was a little nerve-wracking.
I'm sure. I have more questions for you. I want to say goodbye to Andrew Nuska. He has to go. Andrew, we certainly appreciate you being with us today. Andrew Nuska, who is an editor here at ZDNet. Thank you for joining in on the conversation, Andrew.
My pleasure. It was a lot of fun, guys.
Yeah, we'll talk next time. So back to you, Rob. I think the idea here, obviously that's a clever stunt and it worked. You guys certainly show your value. How does this apply, though, to social media data?
Well, it doesn't apply directly. I mean, there's some, there's some debate about whether Gmail or whether email is social, whether it fits in that realm or not. Obviously, it's not shared the way that social normally is, but emails do get passed around a lot. So we were just trying to highlight, the broader trend of you're putting a lot of data in the cloud, right? Most of your data used to be stored on your PC. That's the tool that you used for creation. Now you're creating data in these third-party applications like Gmail, like Twitter, like Facebook, LinkedIn, Salesforce, Basecamp, whatever it is. And you're creating it with multiple devices, an iPad, a mobile phone, a web browser. And so data's proliferating everywhere, and your data protection schemes need to match that.
Yeah, we have a question coming in from Dave, who's asking a little bit about the idea of being able to back up in the cloud, concerns about security. How are you able to make sure that data that's backed up in the cloud remains secure?
Yeah, so I don't know if he's addressing sort of us or an original data provider, but there's a couple different things, right? Anytime you're going to engage a SaaS provider like a Salesforce or Google for Google Apps, you definitely want to read their terms of service. You definitely want to understand their security policies. There's always somebody who's going to have access to the data, the production level data. You want to make sure that's a minimum number of people and that they have the right policies and procedures in place. They should have those documented. And so you want to look at that, right? Because this is an important business asset and you don't want it to just be, you want somebody to take a lot of care with your important business asset. From Backupify's perspective, from backing that up, we're about 3 years old, and one of the challenges we had as a startup was this trust factor, right? Well, how can I trust you? It's part of the reason we built our application on the Amazon Web Services infrastructure, so we leveraged a lot of their security technology, a lot of their certifications. But we've gone further and done a lot of things like, we use military-grade encryption on all the data. We have one of my first full-time hires was a security guy with a master's degree in information security, and we've done things that early-stage startups normally don't spend money on. Like, we were penetration tested by Rapid7, and have done a lot of things to show that our users can trust us, and that we take our obligation to protect their data very seriously.
We got another question about ways that you can measure how much you're saving in regards to using a company like Backupify for storage in the cloud versus on-premise. Is there a way that you guys are able to track that, or is it based on company size?
Yeah, it's really based on the type of data that you're using, what your alternatives are. In general, what you see actually when you move from on-premise to the cloud is it's partially an accounting change, right? It's a capital change from a capital expenditure to an operating expenditure, and you're renting things month to month instead of buying them way in advance and then amortizing them over time.
Okay, and last question we're getting is in regards to the specifics that we've been talking about in regards to social media data. Is there a way that you can quantify or track what you're using in terms of putting the media out there versus what's coming back with you? I guess the idea here is that if you're able to put a strategy together, put tweets out, and then see how that affects a certain product or a certain service that you're providing, is that something that is of value?
There probably is. There's no single tool that does it all. There are tools like Radian 6 that will try to measure the effectiveness of your social media campaigns. Google Analytics obviously is good for some of that. There's new tools like Kissmetrics that help. So one of the problems that you have with social media is that people come from lots of different places, and they come and they come back, and it's not as simple as, hey, I'm searching for a TV, I go to this link, I'm buying a TV, it's shipped to me. It's a little more intangible, and so some of these tools like Kissmetrics are sort of measuring users across multiple visits to your website, multiple interactions, different things like that. So I think to do it effectively, you need a series of tools.
I don't think that this is a conversation that's going to go away anytime soon. I think until we find a really accurate way to measure the ROI, this is going to continue. Do you have any final thoughts as we kind of wrap up today's Hot Topics?
Sure. Final thoughts on measuring social media.
We'll get your final thoughts on Backupify too.
Yeah. So final thoughts on measuring social media. I'm not sure the measurement was always that accurate in the pre-social media world as well. I think maybe in the web piece of the world it was, but it is there. It's getting better, and I think it'll continue to improve. And then final thoughts on Backupify. I think I would just say the best practices that you had on premise, they're still the best practices in the cloud. And when you move to the cloud, the nature of the threats change. So you're less worried about hard drive failure, and you're more worried about user error. You're worried about hacked accounts. You're worried about third-party applications that tie into your data sets now. And so it's always good to have a backup plan.
Great. Well, with that, Rob, we'll make that the final word. I want to thank you, Rob May, CEO and co-founder of Backupify, for being with us today.
Thanks for having me. I enjoyed it.
If for some reason you came in late or you missed part of today's program, I want to let you know that this is going to be available in its entirety on demand, and it'll be so fairly quickly. For myself, Andrew Neska with ZDNet, I want to say thank you again for joining us for this edition of Hot Topics. We've been talking about the value of social media data. It's a conversation which is going to continue long after this program is over. Thanks for being with us.